Welcome to Doing, Being, Thinking, Dialectical Behavior Therapy skills for making a life worth living. I'm your host, Eric Nykamp, a therapist and clinical director at the Grand Rapids campus of Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services, a mental health practice with campuses throughout the great state of Michigan. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Doing, Being, Thinking, a podcast exploring the what, when, and how of using dialectical behavior therapy skills for making a life worth living. My name's Eric. I'm a DBT therapist and one of the clinical directors at Adolescent and Family Behavioral Health Services. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about mindfulness. And joining me today is my very good friend, Selena Engel, another one of the clinical directors here at Adolescent and Family. How are you doing today, Selena?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good too. I've been up long enough, so I've got good energy. So thank you, coffee.
Hot chocolate for me because I'm not a coffee drinker.
All right. Good. Well, let's start off with this question. What is mindfulness?
So many things. It's one of those things that I usually ask my clients. I go, what do you think mindfulness is? And more than 75% of the time, people will tell me meditation.
Right.
And I have to say, well, meditation is a form of mindfulness, but not actually full mindfulness. So to me, mindfulness can be almost anything. We do it on a daily basis, and a lot of times we don't even realize we're doing it because it's when you just focus on one thing in the moment, you get lost in that one thing, and everything outside kind of just goes away. You're focusing, You're not multitasking. You're not thinking about what you need to make for dinner later. You're not thinking about what was that conversation that I had, or why did they roll their eyes at me when I said this one thing in that conversation 3 days ago? It's like just focusing on whatever task or object or thought that you're having in that moment. And when you're doing that, you're being mindful.
Yeah. When I think about mindfulness, sometimes I think about my dog. My dog's name is Happy. And Happy is really good at living in the moment. Whoever he's with, he's really with. Like, he wants to be right next to them. If they move, he moves. And when I come home from work, a lot of times he's figured out at this point, where does the sunlight come through all the windows in the house as the day goes along? So he will move where he takes his naps to different places that are like sunny on the floor. So if I come home now, I can expect he'll be in the living room with the light coming through the front window, laying right by the front door so he can greet me when I walk in, but also right up until then, he's very comfortable. And he's
That's why I want to be reincarnated as a dog or a cat.
And like, in the book, it'll say things like, intentional living with awareness in the present moment. For me, that means being like my dog. And you're not worrying about what happened earlier, and you're not worrying about what's going to happen. You're just here.
Just enjoying the sun.
Yeah, taking things in. Yep, absolutely.
Love it. One of the taking from our DBT book, one of the hardest things to practice by being mindful is without judging.
Yeah.
Or rejecting the moment. Because sometimes, we like to do that.
Yeah.
So we say don't get stuck on thoughts. You kind of just let them come and go. It's like, don't push them away, but don't get stuck on them. So we say like conveyor belt. Like just noticing coming in on the conveyor belt saying, yep, I'm having that thought. Yep, but I don't need to think about it right now because I'm trying to be mindful. So then let that thought go right back out.
Yeah. That's right. Because we are going to probably have some judgments or some evaluations that we're making, but to not get stuck on them and just like
Yes.
spin and spin and spin on that thought. Like notice like, oh, yep, there I go, being a normal human being, making some judgments. Um, Also moving on.
Yes. Yep. Say, oh, I had that judgment. Okay.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
that sounds like me.
I am more the doing something and then I'm like, oh, what do I want for dinner tonight? Do I have that? Do I have to stop
Mhm.
at the store?
Yeah.
That's more where my brain goes more than the judging. And then I have to remember, you know what? Dinner thoughts and plans can wait. I'm finishing this right now. Usually, I'll be honest, it's usually when I'm doing my notes for work. Be honest. And then I have to say, nope, I need to finish this note. And then I can think about dinner.
Well, when do you think we'd want to use mindfulness? When is it useful?
I want to say all the time.
That's what I was going to say too.
It's like, it's always useful. When we want to give something our whole attention.
Mhm.
A lot of people, and we don't realize that we can also be mindful when having a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
You want to give them your whole attention. So you want to be mindful of them and what they're saying. So, because in your head, if you're thinking about 18 other things, you're not being mindful of that person in front of you, and they're going to pick up on that and they're going to feel bad.
Yeah.
So, like I said, when I do my notes for work, it's good to be mindful, or my notes will start saying I need to pick up a roast and some carrots. And that probably shouldn't be in there.
I find for myself, I have some pretty intense emotions, especially judgments. Oh my gosh. And so whenever I have unwanted negative emotions, that's when I find that mindfulness can also be really helpful because when I remember like, oh, I need to be mindful right now. I'm kind of in my negative thought spiral. I get to choose where I direct my attention.
Yes.
And is that easy? No, it's not easy. My brain is like everybody else's brain, and I want to go back to the thing I was just thinking about that was making me feel unpleasant. But if I can sink my attention into something else, I give that part of my brain a break that was spent being miserable. And with practice, it gets better. So for me, like one that I've been doing lately is I'll go up to my art studio and I like to paint. And it's taken a few months to develop this new routine because sometimes I'm going up there when I am feeling sad. And I will put on this happy music and I'm going to put it on loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to sing with the music while I'm painting. I'm doing a lot of things. But where my attention ends up going after a little bit is what interesting thing can I do with this painting in front of me? And that's eventually where my attention ends up. And I'm being very mindful then.
So
And
you're
what
preparing your brain to be mindful.
I am preparing my brain. And I'm also preparing my brain to go through an emotion shift.
Mm-hmm.
Because the sad thing that I think about, it's not changing. It's just something that's sad.
Mm-hmm. Mindfulness can be used so much, like so much. It's like we often, I don't want to say joke because it's not joke, it's not the right word, but we often will say mindfulness is a skill in itself and we don't realize it very much.
Yeah.
It's like, how many times do we tell people, you know what? If you're feeling a little, starting to get a little anxious or you're starting to get a little upset, go for a walk. Well, that
Mhm.
walk is being mindful.
Yep.
We're using that as, a mindfulness practice, and that mindfulness skill can be used for so many things. It's so beneficial to just be in the moment and kind of let the other stuff go. Just be in the moment.
So I also take a walk every day with my dog. sometimes multiple times. And one of the things that I'll try to do when I'm being mindful is I'll try to give myself things to pay attention to, especially if I've had a hard day. Yesterday was a very, very hard day for me. And so I went out and I was like, what's the temperature? Like how hot or cold is it? Can I tell? Well, what does that feel like? Can I hear the grass? Can I hear the wind blowing on the grass? What do the clouds look like when I'm walking around outside? Like
So
I'm just
you're
giving
using your
myself things
five
to attend to.
senses.
Yeah. And I'm actually just assigning those things to myself because it's very easy to think about the horrible, no good, very bad day that I just had. And it was a mindful walk.
Yeah. It's so easy to perseverate on the negative.
Yep.
I
What
think
does my dog think is interesting? Yeah. All that kind of
yeah.
stuff.
I was just going to say, like, I think we've said it in one of our other podcasts that it takes 5 positives to outweigh 1 negative.
Yes.
So you assigning yourself these positive things to look at is like you telling your brain, we're going to be positive.
Yep. Or at least we're going to shift to something neutral.
Yes.
Yep.
That's a good point too, to tell people. I tell people all the time, it's like, you don't have to switch because they tell me like, how am I going to switch from negative to positive? Like, but you don't have to switch all the way to positive. You can switch to a neutral. That's, getting your brain out of the negative. Switch to a neutral.
I was talking with one person and they kind of like, they were kind of judging themselves for it. They're like, oh, I feel like I'm this really old person. But their mindfulness practice is that they get a 500 or a 1,000 piece puzzle. They keep it out on the dining room table. And at this point, this person was living alone. So loneliness is the trigger. And they said, when I start thinking about how lonely I am and I don't have anything to do, I assign my brain the job of putting this puzzle together. They're like, I don't want to say that it's working, but it really helps. And
They are my people. I love puzzles.
And it was like, here's this simple thing. I'm like, well, let's think about what you're doing. You're being mindful. You're thinking about like, is this a piece that's like one hole between 2 tabs? Or is this you kind of know, and you're searching like, where's the next purple piece? Oh, it's not that color purple. This is more of a lavender purple.
You definitely have to be thinking about that puzzle when you're doing a puzzle.
Yeah. So, and just having the puzzle out allowed them to practice mindfulness in a more accessible way when it was really tough.
I love that. I'm also a puzzle geek. So,
well, we've been talking about it, but like, are there any other ways that people use this skill?
Other ways that they use it?
Yeah, other ways of practicing mindfulness.
There's a billion ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mindfulness. So, because you can do it like anywhere. Like we said earlier, meditation, that's a way. Thinking of we often call it your safe space. So thinking of your safe space, like mine is in the woods with a little brook running through. When I will use that quite often of like, bringing myself down is thinking of my safe space. So I'm being mindful of my safe space. When people drive, I'm hoping they're being mindful. Fingers crossed there that they're being mindful. Everyday life. Like there's so much, like, this is what I will point out all the time to clients that I'm like, oh, you were being mindful. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, oh, did you do that? Were you thinking about anything else while you're doing it? They're like, no, I was just doing it. Oh, so you were being mindful. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things that's hard to tell when you're doing it, but you feel good when you're doing it.
Yeah. Some of the things that they're in your book, and we don't usually go over these a lot of times in the detail that it could be helpful. So I'm hoping this podcast episode actually can be helpful, if you haven't heard these things before, sometimes people will talk about prayer as being mindful. And it says in the book, like contemplative prayer. And like, not everybody knows what that means, but many different religions have forms of contemplative prayer. I'll tell you about how one in the Christian tradition works. And so let's talk about centering prayer. Centering prayer isn't like, let's make a list of all the things that are wrong to tell God about. Right? Can you imagine how that would like just stir up your emotions? Right? That's not the kind of prayer we're talking about. This is also not help me prayers. Like I need to be rescued. It's not that kind of prayer. Those are legitimate forms of prayer, but it's not mindfulness. Yes. Centering prayer is something like sitting and saying, Jesus, I'm here. And repeating that over and over. Where the goal is to center yourself, as opposed to like spraying your attention all over the many, many things that are not working well. Okay, so instead of spraying, we're staying.
Like
or
that.
Things like mindfulness movement, so yoga or doing exercise slowly, or even like if you're walking, to pay attention to what your body feels like. Drawing your attention to your body is very, very mindful. And so if you notice, like what are the common things here is that it's like the focusing of attention in a really directional way. So it's like your attention is like a laser beam, and you're in charge of where the laser beam points. And it takes work.
It does. Like everything. Like all things that are good for you. It takes practice.
Yeah, like all things. Well, how does this skill help us make a life worth living?
So in our book, part of the goals of mindfulness is to reduce suffering and increase happiness. So it's reducing pain, tension, and stress. Like Eric was just saying, with like yoga, the walking, doing that mindfully will help us reduce that pain and tension.
Yeah.
Because we're focusing on ourselves, and it's like, oh, like there's a pain I've never felt before. Let me go do something about that. So that means we're recognizing that we're having these things. And then when we're doing our yoga, we're stretching them out. So we're loosening up the tension.
When you're talking about pain, are we talking about just physical pain, or are we talking about emotional pain as well?
Both.
Yeah, I agree.
And stress and tension. So they can all be physical and they can all be emotional.
Yeah.
So mindfulness can actually help reduce both the emotional pain, tension, and stress, and the physical pain.
I was sitting with somebody yesterday, and we were deciding to do this. I could see when they were telling me about this hard thing in their life that they were getting really uncomfortable. And so what I was noticing was the longer we talked, they were kind of like folding their arms, you know how people do. But there's like folding your arms where like your hands are just on top of your other hands, which feels to me a little bit more open. And what they're doing, their hands are like in the crooks of their elbow, and they're like tucking them in, and the arms are going higher and higher up the body. And their legs were crossed.
They were closed off.
And their head was starting to come down a little bit. Like it was sort of like their body was doing a croissant shape.
Yeah.
So we just paused a minute and said, let's go through 4 parts of your body. And these are the parts I like to use, like heart, lungs, muscles, stomach. And just like asking those 4 questions, like what is my heart doing? How's my breathing? How tense or relaxed do my muscles feel, and where are those? And what does my stomach feel like? And when they got to their stomach, they're like, I wasn't noticing this, but my stomach is jumping all over the place. It's like, well, what do you think that means? I don't know. Okay. Well, what would happen if we sat in a different position and just tried it for 3 minutes and just try breathing where you're sending air all the way down to your stomach? What do you think might happen? Oh, I have no idea. I've never done that before. Okay, well, let's try it. Their distress level when they started out was at an 8. And by focusing on breathing really deep down to their stomach and blowing out really slowly, they reduced their tension level to a 4 in 3 minutes. So they cut it in half.
With one simple mindfulness task.
Yeah, just attending to that, just noticing, what does my body feel like? In particular, what is my stomach feeling like? And I think that's kind of the thing, right? Like, it's pain, but it's also drawing on that emotional pain. And they're linked.
Yeah, very much so. How often do we tell people, like, your physical is linked to your emotions and your emotions is linked to your physical? Like, oh, you're having, I don't know, arm surgery. Like, how are you feeling about that? Oh, well, I'm kind of mad because now I can't do these things that I used to be able to do because my arm hurts. So now I'm angry. So it's like, okay. So it's like oftentimes the two go hand in hand, physical and emotional.
Yeah.
Our mindfulness also lets us increase control of our own minds, which is
Yeah.
a good thing because sometimes we let our mind control our own actions. So by practicing some mindfulness, we can take back control. So your example you just used was a good one. Like, the emotions were taking control of her. She was shutting down and all these things. And once she started being mindful, she opened back up. So she was taking back control of her mind instead of letting the emotions control her.
I remember this story from my mom where she would do things like this. So in the house that I grew up in, every room had carpet. And there would be these days where things would not be going really well. And my mom would do this thing where it didn't matter how everything else was going. What she could do was focus on vacuuming. And the way she would vacuum when it was really a hard day to take control of her mind was she would focus on almost like how you'd mow a lawn. She's going to vacuum the room in a straight line so that all the lines from the vacuum cleaner line up perfectly. And it was like this giant, she would never say, this is a giant meditation exercise. But essentially, this is what it was. It's like this, it's being careful. And you cannot mow or you cannot vacuum in a straight line without being super mindful. And she would just sit there and line up all these vacuum marks in a straight line. And so I'd come home at the end of the day and I could see the lines in the carpet. And it was like the leftover evidence of taking control of your mind. And I'm like, how many hours did it take to do that through the whole house?
Yes.
There might be days where that's what it takes. Like, everything else is going to pot. But what I can do is I can vacuum.
Yep.
And at least the mess on the floor goes somewhere that I want it to go.
Exactly. I can manage this one thing in my life.
Manage this.
Another goal of mindfulness is to experience reality as it is. Because sometimes, when we're not being mindful of a situation, we interpret. We just kind of interpret what's happening. So we want to live life with our eyes wide open and experience the reality of our connection to the universe, the essential goodness, and essential validity. We want to basically experience reality with our facts instead of our interpretations.
How do you do that in your own life?
I'm one that I work very hard for when I have conversations with someone or sessions with people that I am in that session and I'm in that conversation. So that way I'm not misinterpreting things. Like I'm like hearing you, but then I'll also ask, so this is what I think you're saying. So that way I can check myself because I don't want to get down the road and say, well, this is how I took that and it'd be wrong. And they're like, that's not my intention at all. So I will ask. It's like, hey, this is what I heard. Is that what you're saying? Because that does a couple of things. That shows the person I'm actually listening and actually being mindful of our conversation and what they're saying means something to me. A big one, and I've said this on other podcasts, a big one for me is emails and text messages.
Yeah. Normal human stuff.
Normal human stuff, because I can read into those like no other. So I will often have to use some mindfulness, use some safe space, calming techniques, and be like, okay, let me reread this and see if I'm interpreting something, which I often am. So then I can check myself before. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. So I can check myself before I, send my immediate response that I had.
Check yourself before you wreck yourself. That's very good.
Oldie but goodie.
Well, I hope that gives everybody who's listening an idea of how to use mindfulness to make a life worth living. Well, it can take a lifetime for any of us to master any skill. With practice, it's going to get progressively easier over time. We hope that all of you listening continue doing, being, and thinking in wise ways on your way to making a life worth living. Selena, I always enjoy having these kind of conversations with you.
Me too.
Good. Well, let's do it sometime again soon, okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Doing, Being, Thinking is an educational podcast about dialectical behavior therapy and is not intended as a substitute for therapy. This is a podcast outreach of adolescent and family behavioral health services offering both in-person and telehealth therapy to children, teens, and adults throughout Michigan. If you are a Michigan resident and want to get started with therapy, including DBT, children's DBT, or other evidence-based therapies, please contact us at 616-719-0194 or find us on the web at www.adolescentfamilybhs.com.